Welcome to a video tutorial of AuctionRPM. My name is Dan Zumwalt and I'll be your guide through this discussion of expenses in AuctionRPM. In AuctionRPM, there are several different kinds of expenses that can be entered into the system, and those different kinds of expenses are handled in different ways, and we'll discuss those different manners that the expenses are handled. To begin with, let's go to Accounting and then Expenses at the top. And this option menu has about 6 options. We're going to talk initially about the first 5 here at the top. Now these 5 buttons that we're looking at here, they well illustrate the different kinds of expenses that are entered into AuctionRPM. First and foremost, you have Add General Auction Expense. Here at the top here, this button allows you to add expenses that are general in their nature. And a good way to identify what kinds of expenses this represents money exiting the auctioneer's pocket. This would be things like porta potties, rent-a-cops, tent rentals, things along those lines. Now these 4 buttons down here, these buttons represent expenses that are actually income to the auctioneer. This represents money entering the auctioneer's pocket. You'll notice that they're broken down here on the left by buyer expenses and here on the right by consignor expenses, and so these represent monies that would be charged to either the buyers or to the consignors. In the case of buyers, if you enter in expenses here, these expenses show up on the buyer invoice, whereas here on the right, these expenses show up on the settlement statements that you would create for the consignor. You'll notice that for both buyers and consignors, you have general expenses and item-specific expenses. A general buyer expense, a good example of that would be a bounce check charge that you would be charging to a buyer next time they come in for an amount that they bounced. How about an item-specific buyer expense? That would be, let's say, that you wish to charge an amount to the buyer for a specific item. Let's say it's a vehicle, and you needed to charge a title fee or dock fee. General consignor expense, typical of that would be apportioned advertising. Let's suppose that you and the consignor contractually agree that the consignor is going to pay a portion of the advertising for this auction. Maybe they're going to pay all of the advertising. At any rate, when you want to charge the consignor that amount for the advertising or whatever other amount that you need to charge that's not item specific, you would enter it under general consignor expenses. However, if you do have an item specific consignor expense, you would enter it here. Good example of that is, again, if you're selling a vehicle, then you would, and let's suppose that the consignor wants that vehicle detailed before the auction, well, you could add in the amount for that detailing here. Oftentimes what's happening in this case of, let's say, detailing, you'll have a detailer come out to your auction site the day before the auction, and that detailer will detail X number of cars for you, the auctioneer. Well, the detailer will charge you a certain amount for the detailing of all those cars, and you'll put that expense here in the general auction expense, because indeed the auctioneer had to pay the detailer to come out and detail those cars. But then the auctioneer would turn around and enter in item-specific consignor expenses so that the amounts that need to be charged to the consignor will be charged once the consignment settlement statements were done. And oftentimes, let's say the detailer charged you $100 to detail a vehicle. Well, maybe down here in the item-specific consignor expense you would charge $150 or whatever would be appropriate. So what we're looking at here again is 5 different kinds of expenses. This first one is money exiting the auctioneer's pocket, and these other 4 represent money entering the auctioneer's pocket. Now if we go into general auction expense here, we're going to see our different auctions that we have been working with here. We have auction number 1, which is a sample auction that comes with every installation of AuctionRPM. We also have the new sample auction here. I'll click on that. And you can see here that we have no expenses that are general in their nature entered in here for the new sample auction. So let's suppose that I want to enter in an expense for tent rentals. I want to make sure that those expenses are reflected in my auction analysis and summary so that I get an accurate picture of what the net profit is for this auction. So with new sample auction highlighted here, I'm going to hit add, and then it's going to ask me for some key pieces of information for this expense, such as what is the expense type, what is the date of the expense, and the amount, and perhaps an optional expense memo that I want to put in here. So I'm going to go ahead and click on expense type, and I'm going to select tent rental. Tent rental isn't here, so I'm going to click on new, add new, in order to add a new tent rental. And I'll go ahead and type in a new tent rental expense type. Now that I've entered a new tent rental expense type, I'll click Save here, and now that expense type is returned back to the screen where I'm entering in this new expense. Just like any auto locator in AuctionRPM, if I click on expense type again, you'll see that tent rental expense type sitting here waiting for the next auction when I need to enter in a general auction expense for tent rentals. Now I'll identify the date that I want this tent rental to be expensed out to, and then the flat amount. And so I'll say that the tent rental was $150, and then I'll hit save. So now here is a tent rental for $150 that I've put in, and I've associated it with new sample auction. You can see that if I click on sample auction, auction number 1, then there is no expenses there. If I click on new sample auction, again, that's where the expense is that I want to have associated here. Let's exit out of this screen and see where this expense shows up. If I go to auctions and then I go to after auction, you'll notice that the first report here is the auction analysis and summary. I click on that, and then I select my new sample auction, the one we've been working with in this video tutorial series. I'll click print summary, and now when I go down to the bottom of this report under grand totals, you'll notice that there is a general auction expense here now totaling $150. If we had multiple general auction expenses, they would be listed here, and you can see now that the $150 is taken off of the gross income, thus giving me an accurate picture of what my net profit is for the auction here. Also, you'll notice that if I look back up in this list here, there are lines in this summary area where I can identify what the total buyer expenses are, or the total consignor expenses. Now in the case of consignor expenses, you can see here that they're broken out by item-specific expenses and general expenses, and the totals would be showing here. Let's exit out of here and come back to the main menu. Now, one thing about expenses, if I go back to the Accounting and Expenses tab, you of course can see the different places where these expenses can be entered in. However, interesting thing about expenses is that they can be entered in several different places in AuctionRPM. The main menu is only one place where they can be entered in, but they certainly can be entered in several different places. Let's see an illustration as to how that is the case. If we take a look at an illustration here, we can see that under this illustration, not only do we have the main menu expense entry that we've been discussing up to these points, but we also have the same options found under the Buyer Master expense entry, Consignor Master expense entry, and Inventory Master expense entry. Let's take a look at how that is the case here back in AuctionRPM. If I go to Tools and then I click on Master Data, then if I click on Buyers, you can see here that one of the tabs on the Buyer Master for Buy-Em and High-Em is Expenses. And in here I can enter in general buyer expenses for this particular buyer. I can add and delete them here, and if I want to, I can optionally show only unpaid expenses or all expenses. I can do the same thing for consignors. If I click on consignors, you notice that there's an expenses tab there as well, where I can add, delete, and edit those expenses. And again, for buyers and consignors, entry here are the general expenses, only the ones that are general in nature and not the item-specific expenses. For item-specific expenses, I'm going to exit out of here. We'll go up to Auctions, and under the Preparation tab, let's click on Inventory Master. In Inventory Master, for this railroad spike, we can see here that there is an Expenses tab as well. Here, though, we can enter in item-specific expenses. These are expenses specific to the railroad spike, and we can enter in this one location either item-specific buyer expenses or item-specific consignor expenses. Now, one last thing that I'd like to show you is if we go to Accounting and Expenses, there's this option down here. Under Post Prorated Consignor Expenses, we can identify expenses that are prorated amongst all of the consignors in that auction. Let's suppose that it's your contractual agreement with the consignors that each consignor would pay their fair share of the expenses in the auction. Let's say we're talking about advertising. So let's click on, for instance, the sample auction here, or let's click on, let's say, the new sample auction here. Let's say that we have George Consignor here. Now, in this case, George Consignor is the only one that we have sold material for in this new sample auction. And so you can see, of course, 100% of the total sales in this auction was for George Consignor. But under normal circumstances, you would probably have a whole slew of consignors listed here. And for each consignor, it would show how much you sold for that consignor, as well as the percentage of the total sales that this consignor that you've sold for this consignor. So maybe George Consignor would be 10%, Sally Smith would be maybe you have sold a lot more for Sally, and so maybe 55% of the total sale is for Sally Smith, and then bringing it all together, the third consignor here, you've sold 35% of the total sales for the auction for that third consignor. Then what you can do is you can identify an expense type and an expense amount here, and in doing so, it will then calculate based upon the percent of total sales for this consignor in this auction. It would give you an amount that should be posted out of this total expense for that consignor. That way it would evenly distribute the expense. Let's say we're typing in $1,000, it would distribute the $1,000 amongst the three consignors here based upon the percentage of total sales of for that consignor in that auction. That way each consignor ends up paying their fair share of that $1,000 of expenses. Once you have all of the amounts set up properly, then you can choose Post Expenses, and it will create general consignor expenses. In our example, 3 of them for the 3 consignors here, 1 for each consignor, and it would post those expenses to each consignor's record, and thus those amounts would be removed from the amounts that would be remitted back to the consignor at the end of the auction. Let's also take a look real quick at what the different expenses look like when we're processing expenses for a consignor. Let's say for George Consignor, I'm going to go into General Consignor Expense here, and I'm going to enter in an expense for him that will be taken out of the proceeds that you pay to George at that auction. So let's go ahead and hit Add here for George Consignor. We're going to identify which auction we're doing this for, so we'll do it for the new sample auction. The expense type, there's our 3 expense types, including that one I just created a few moments ago. I'll say that this is a delivery fee though. And the flat amount, let's say by automatic we have $135 there. In this case I'll just say that I want to charge him $10 for a delivery fee. I'll hit Save, and now we have a $10 delivery fee there. I'll exit out of here, and now if I go to Auctions, After Auction, and I print report number 82, the consignment fees due report, just as an example, I'll print Selected Summary. I'll say specific auction is the new sample auction. specific consignor is George Consignor. And now if I hit proceed and answer yes to the question as to whether or not I want to recalculate the consignment fees, then it will produce the report for me. And you'll notice here that, yes, I did sell a couch for $100, and the fee was $35 there, and so thus $65 is due. But now down here, there is a general consignor expense for a delivery fee of $100. And so as a result, now we can indicate that we owe George Consignor the appropriate amount. Now, under this circumstance, this is just a demonstration, and so you can see here that I've done things a little out of order here. For instance, I've already paid George Consignor $65, so entry of this $10 general consignor expense causes me to owe George $10 because I've already paid George Consignor $65, and so the total net due is negative $10. That wouldn't quite be correct there, but under normal circumstances you would enter in your general consignor expenses ahead of time before you would process any payments to George Consignor. One other thing too is that if you enter in item-specific expenses, those expenses would be reflected in this column here for the couch, assuming I entered in an item-specific consignor expense. That expense would be shown here, and a detail for those expenses would be shown in between where it says couch and where this totals line is here. I'll go ahead and hit exit, return back to the main menu, and that will conclude our discussion of expenses for AuctionRPM. If you have any questions about this video about expenses or any other videos that are in the AuctionRPM video tutorial series, please don't hesitate to give us a call. Our phone number is area code 209-588-1232. Thank you for listening.